All somewhat familiar with the idea that every single decision Putin's made in relation to the Ukraine war is really about his own ego. And if you look at things through that perspective, you really do get shocking accuracy. So let's explore this a bit further. In autocratic regimes of all kinds, you see the same exact conflation between the dictator, the regime, and the whole country, and the population at large. If you criticize Putin, you criticize Russia. If you want to remove Putin, you want to destroy Russia, that sort of thing. It's basically a sort of ego projection in all directions. And it's important not to mistake this for actual ego diffusion, which is what happens in real communities. When I say all directions, I mean the following. Putin projects his ego onto Russia itself, his followers project their egos onto him and onto Russia. So this means that when Putin himself speaks about Russia, or he says, "we the Russian people," he's really talking about himself. Let me show you a seriously staggering example in one of Putin's most genuine speeches to date, his 2012 election victory speech. When he says "we" or "us" or "Russia," just replace that with "me, myself." And you'll just see exactly what goes on in his mind. It's unbelievable. Just do that in this next clip.
Спасибо всем, кто сказал «да» великой России. Я вас спросил однажды, мы победим? Мы победили! Мы победили в открытой и честной борьбе. Но это были не только выборы президента России. Это был очень важный тест для всех нас, для всего нашего народа. Мы показали, что нам действительно никто ничего не может навязать. Никто и ничего. Мы показали, что наши люди действительно в состоянии легко отличить желание к новизне, к обновлению от политических провокаций, которые ставят перед собой только одну цель – развалить российскую государственность и узурпировать власть. Мы победили сегодня, и благодаря подавляющей поддержке подавляющего большинства наших избирателей одержали чистую победу. Мы будем работать честно и напряженно. Мы добьемся успехов, и мы призываем всех объединиться вокруг интересов нашего народа и нашей Родины. Я обещал вам, что мы победим. Мы победили! Слава России!
Pretty goddamn crazy, huh? You replace the words "we," "us," or "Russia" with "myself," you get a direct glimpse into his psyche. I have shown today that nobody and nothing can tell me what to do. I've been able to save myself from political provocations that only have one goal: to destroy my statehood and usurp my power. It's exactly like Louis XIV saying "I am the state," except this time it's subconscious instead of an open statement. Oh, and of course, at the end you get, "I've won. Glory to myself." Also, don't forget the crowd chanting Putin's name. It's exactly the same process, just in the opposite direction. All those thousands of people are really just chanting "myself, myself, myself." But this doesn't cause any disharmony on the surface, because in this context, they're all projecting their ego onto the same exact person. So why is this a problem? Well, remember the inherent traits of the ego: preservation, expansion. If your only lens is the ego, everything under your control is to be preserved, and everything outside of it is to be expanded into. It's obviously analogous to the reproduction instinct and survival instinct of any other living being. So don't go seeing the ego as some universally evil thing that is to be detested and overcome by default. The problem here is just that if you put the ego at the top, and it's the most fundamental value, and it is the highest good, then you get the sort of things that you see in Russia these days. For example, you're all familiar with the NATO expansion argument, and that Russia had no choice but to invade Ukraine because of this. Rationally speaking, this obviously doesn't make any sense. Russia has 6,000 nuclear weapons, which makes the threat of invasion non-existent no matter how many millions of NATO soldiers are stationed on its borders. Look at it through the lens of the ego, and this argument makes much, much, much more sense. Let's say someone just cuts off your hand and transplants it onto someone else's arm without asking you permission. I think odds are you'd be pretty furious about this. And imagine the guy who did this afterwards went out and told you how the arm that he cut off and put onto the other guy is incredibly good and helping him do great things, and it's a good thing that he did it. And if only you'd understood, then you would have agreed to it anyway. But because you're an absolute idiot, you didn't agree to it, so he was forced to cut off your hand. Your hand is obviously part of your ego. It's what you use to get things done, it's part of your body, it's connected to your nervous system, etc., etc. Now, let's call your hand East Germany. And let's call the rest of your arm Eastern Europe, and your right leg is called Georgia, Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and you get the point. From the perspective of the ego, there is no question of whether Estonia perhaps needed a different economic and political system, or whether it was maybe horrifically abused for no morally justifiable reason. It was your hand, and someone just cut it off.
They played us like a damn fiddle! Give it back! This isn't right, that was ours! We built it, damn it!
You see, the real world, with its real mundane realities, is completely unimportant to the detached ego. The ego just wants power. And any time its power is increased is seen as nothing special, because that's just how it should be. While any transgression, no matter how reasonable and mild, leads to roiling, burning resentment. Criticizing Russia is a transgression regardless of whether the criticism is true or not. Helping Ukraine fight the West is a transgression regardless of what the Ukrainian people want. Defensive alliances like NATO are nothing but a conspiracy to destroy Russia, regardless of what being ruled by Russia or Moscow entails in reality. If you have to lie, cheat, murder, torture, steal, or whatever else, for the sake of ego preservation, you just do it. And remember, I'm talking about the Russian state here as much as I'm talking about Russian people and culture and history, down to the individual level. I mean, why do you think that corruption is so insanely widespread, taking up something like half the military budget according to most pre-war insider estimates I've seen?
On a side note, if you want to see an incredibly insightful example for this sort of thing, I suggest you watch this interview with Sergei Pugachev, which was done pretty much right after the invasion in Ukraine. And my God, it's incredible. Not just because of the insider knowledge he has on the Russian government, but also that you can see in the interview directly like the two egos of the interviewer and Sergei Pugachev like fighting constantly, where Sergei constantly wants to talk about the story that he's telling, and the interviewer just wants to know practical knowledge about the war. It's perfect. I didn't even notice this until I was done recording, basically.
Remember the crowd chanting Putin's name. In that context, they obviously project their egos onto Putin. But let's say you're selling a government building, and you're left to decide whether you keep some of the sales money for yourself. What do? You say, glory to myself, and you take whatever money you can. After all, why shouldn't you have it? Unfortunately, this sort of future is what awaits the West if current trends continue, as society is getting more and more fragmented, not just politically, which really isn't that big of a deal in isolation, but on an individual level. If you haven't heard of or read the book Bowling Alone, it's essentially just a book that shows with tons of statistics how community activities have declined massively since the 60s. A society of isolated egos will inevitably become plagued by the same problems that Russia is so well known for, as relationships become either upward or downward facing and rarely horizontal. Think parasocial streamer relationships, influencers, political leaders, etc. As individuals connect more and more strongly with these people who are far away from them, both physically and more importantly in the social hierarchy, they connect less and less with people who are closer to them. And remember, these sorts of connections with faraway people are almost always based on projection, meaning it reinforces the ego rather than diffusing it. The conclusion of this trend is obviously totalitarianism. I mean, why do you think the NSDAP banned all Boy Scout organizations besides theirs, and the Bolsheviks did the same, and both organizations also did everything they reasonably could to destroy or infiltrate Christian organizations? The social fabric is simply an obstacle to their power, and if this obstacle is removed, their power will be limitless. Keep in mind here that Russia today is far from being a totalitarian state, but still we already see the following problem. The regime brutally represses dissenters, which means that the most honest and principled people are systematically removed, whether it's through murder, imprisonment, exile, whatever else. So how can you possibly expect anyone to resist the system? Everyone's an isolated ego who is threatened by the system. Every single time you resist the regime without toppling it, the people who did the resisting are removed, which makes any future successful uprising even more unlikely. You don't have any large organization within the society that can rival the state. This is a positive feedback loop that's only ever been broken by the internal dysfunctionality of these sorts of systems, because, everyone in there is in it for their own ego, so they parasitize their masters, their society, whoever they can, as long as they think they won't get caught. So that factor, combined with external pressures such as the Cold War, it really is like entropy. Once you reach a certain level of social disintegration, there's no longer a real way out except for death, whether it's death of the individual or of the society, just dying. So that means we all have our work cut out for us, to say the least, if we want to prevent this from happening. I've covered exactly how this can be prevented and turned into something actually far better than what we have now in 2 other videos I made, so if you're serious about this, I suggest you take the time to watch them.